The morning mist clung to the purple leaves of Altara 7's ancient forest like ghostly fingers. Dr. David Reed adjusted his scanner and stepped carefully over a fallen log covered in bioluminescent moss. This was his third week on the moon, and every day brought new discoveries. The air smelled sweet like honey mixed with rain, and strange bird-like creatures sang melodies that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. David had always been the quiet type back on Earth, while other xenobiologists dreamed of meeting intelligent alien life. He preferred studying plants and small creatures. They were predictable, peaceful, and never tried to eat him. But the research vessel Harmony needed someone to catalog the local wildlife, and David was the best they had for the job. His scanner beeped softly as he approached a cluster of silverbark trees. The readings showed high concentrations of unusual organic compounds just ahead. David pushed through a curtain of hanging vines and found himself in a small clearing dominated by what looked like a massive den carved into a hillside. The entrance was perfectly round, about 8 feet across, with smooth walls that suggested intelligent construction rather than natural formation. Strange symbols were carved around the opening, weathered but still visible. David's heart raced with excitement. This was clearly the work of the planet's native intelligence, the species his team had been hoping to contact for weeks. He activated his recording device and approached slowly. Field log, day 21. I've discovered what appears to be a constructed dwelling of the indigenous species. The architecture suggests advanced planning and possibly tool use. I'm proceeding with standard first contact protocols. As David stepped closer to examine the carved symbols, he heard something that made his blood freeze. A soft whimpering sound came from inside the den, high-pitched and desperate. It sounded like crying, but not human crying. Something was hurt. In there, something young. David hesitated. First contact protocols clearly stated he should observe from a distance and report back to the team before making direct contact. But those sounds tugged at something deep in his chest. Back on Earth, he had spent his childhood rescuing injured birds and nursing sick cats back to health. The instinct to help was stronger than his training. He pulled out his portable light and peered into the den. The beam illuminated a spacious chamber lined with what looked like woven grass and soft leaves. In the center of this nest, 3 small creatures huddled together, their fur matted and their large eyes reflecting his light. They looked like bear cubs, but with longer limbs and more intelligent faces. Their fur was deep brown with silver streaks, and they had hands instead of paws, with opposable thumbs and delicate fingers. One of them, the smallest, appeared to be injured, with dried blood on its left leg. The moment David's light hit them, all 3 cubs stopped whimpering and stared at him with remarkable intensity. Their eyes were huge and dark, filled with an intelligence that made David's breath catch. These weren't just animals. They were children. David made a decision that would change his life forever. He stepped into the den. The cubs didn't flee or show fear. Instead, they seemed curious, tilting their heads and making soft, chattering sounds. The injured one tried to stand but collapsed with a pitiful whine. David's xenobiology training kicked in, and he carefully approached with his medical scanner. "It's okay, little ones," he whispered, surprised by how natural it felt to speak to them. "I'm not going to hurt you." The scanner revealed that the smallest cub had a simple fracture in its leg, probably from a fall. David had basic medical supplies in his kit, designed for treating human injuries but adaptable for other species. As he worked to set a temporary splint, the other 2 cubs moved closer, watching his every move with fascination. What amazed David most was their behavior. They seemed to understand he was helping. They held the injured cub still while David worked, and they responded to his gestures as if they could read his intentions. When he finished the splint, all 3 cubs made a sound that was unmistakably grateful, a soft purring mixed with musical notes. David spent the next hour in the den, sharing water from his canteen and some protein bars from his pack. The cubs ate hungrily, suggesting they had been alone for some time. He began to suspect these were orphans, abandoned or separated from their family somehow. That's when he heard the thunderous roar from outside. David's blood turned to ice as heavy footsteps approached the den entrance. The cubs immediately huddled. Behind him, their earlier calm replaced by obvious terror. Through the entrance, David saw massive shadows moving in the clearing. More roars echoed through the forest, and he realized these were adult members of the cub species. A creature appeared in the den entrance that made David's knees weak. It stood 9 feet tall, covered in the same brown and silver fur as the cubs, but with muscles like tree trunks and claws that could tear through metal. Its face was both bear-like and eerily human, with intelligent eyes that burned with protective fury. The adult creature roared again, a sound that shook leaves from the trees outside. Behind it, David could see others, an entire group of the massive beings surrounding the den. They were armed with spears and clubs that looked primitive but deadly effective. The largest creature pointed a clawed finger at David and spoke in a deep, rumbling voice that somehow conveyed meaning, despite being in an alien language. The message was clear. Leave the cubs alone and get out. David slowly raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "I was just helping," he said, knowing they couldn't understand his words but hoping his tone would convey his peaceful intentions. The little one was hurt, but the adult creatures weren't interested in explanations. They advanced into the den, and David had no choice but to back away from the cubs. As he moved toward the entrance, something unexpected happened. The 3 cubs scrambled after him, crying out in their musical voices. They tried to follow him outside, but the adult creatures blocked their path. David retreated across the clearing as the massive beings formed a protective wall around their den. He could hear the cubs calling behind him, their voices full of distress. It broke his heart to leave them, but he had no choice. These creatures saw him as a threat to their young. As David made his way back through the forest toward his camp, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made both the best and worst decision of his life. He had helped 3 orphaned children, but he had also created what could become a dangerous conflict between species. Behind him, the cubs' cries echoed through the trees, and David couldn't help but look back. What he saw made his heart sink. 3 small figures had broken away from the adult creatures and were following him at a distance, their large eyes fixed on the human who had shown them kindness. The cubs had refused to leave him alone. David's hands shook as he packed his emergency supplies into his backpack. Through the walls of his research shelter, he could hear them. The cubs were out there, making soft calling sounds that tugged at his heart like invisible strings. He had tried everything to make them go back to their people. He had walked them halfway to the den 3 times, only to have them follow him back to camp each time. Now their guardians were coming, and they were angry. The ground vibrated with heavy footsteps, and David heard the adult creatures crashing through the forest. Their roars echoed between the trees, closer now than they had been an hour ago. David grabbed his scanner, his water purifier, and what food he could carry. The research vessel wouldn't return to pick him up for another week, and his radio had been damaged in yesterday's storm. He was completely alone with 3 alien children who thought he was their parent. David stepped outside his shelter and found the cubs waiting for him. In the 3 days since their first meeting, he had started to learn their personalities. The smallest one, the injured female, was clearly the bravest. She always approached him first and seemed to act as a translator between David and the other 2. The middle-sized cub was male and appeared to be the thinker of the group. He would study David's tools and equipment with intense focus, as if trying to understand how they worked. The largest cub was also male and seemed to be the protector. He always positioned himself between David and any potential danger. "Listen, little ones," David said quietly, crouching down to their level. Your people are coming, and they're not happy with me. You need to go back to them now. I'll be fine, but you need to be with your own kind. The smallest cub approached and placed her tiny hand on David's cheek. For a moment, something incredible happened. Images flashed through David's mind, not his own thoughts but hers. He saw the den as she remembered it, warm and safe with adult creatures caring for many cubs. Then he saw darkness, fear, and the adults gone. He saw herself and her brothers hiding in the empty den, hungry and scared, until the strange tall creature with no fur came and made the pain in her legs stop. David gasped and pulled back. The cub had somehow shared her memories with him. These creatures were telepathic, at least to some degree. She was trying to tell him that he had saved them, that they had been abandoned orphans until he found them. I understand, David whispered. But your people are back now. They can take care of you. The cub's large, dark eyes filled with what looked like tears. She shook her head and made a sound that was unmistakably negative. Through their strange mental connection, David felt her emotions. Fear of the angry adults, confusion about why they wanted to take her away from the one who had helped her, and something else. Trust. Complete, absolute trust in David. A roar echoed through the forest, much closer now. David could see movement between the trees. He made a decision that went against every bit of his scientific training. He couldn't leave these children to face angry adults who might punish them for following him. He had to protect them. Okay, he said, standing up and adjusting his backpack. If you won't go back, then we run together. But you have to do exactly what I say, understand? All three cubs nodded eagerly and gathered around his legs. David felt a wave of affection and determination from them through their mental link. They were scared, but they trusted him completely. David led them away from the camp, heading deeper into the forest. He had studied the topographical maps of this region and knew there were caves about 5 miles to the north. If they could reach them, they might be able to hide until David figured out how to communicate properly with the adult creatures. The chase began immediately. David heard the aliens discover his abandoned camp and their roars of anger when they realized he had taken the cubs with him. Heavy footsteps pounded after them through the underbrush, and David knew the adult creatures were much faster than humans, but the cubs were helping him in ways he never expected. The smallest one, despite her injured leg, seemed to know every hidden path through the forest. She led them along game trails that were barely visible to David's eyes, but provided smooth running surfaces. The middle cub kept looking back and chittering warnings whenever their pursuers got too close. The largest cub stayed right beside David, ready to help if he stumbled or fell. As they ran, David began to understand more about his strange companions. Through their intermittent telepathic contact, he learned they had names, or at least concepts that served as names. The smallest one thought of herself as something like Quick Step or Little Fast, which David mentally translated as Pip. The middle cub's name concept involved gathering and understanding, so David thought of him as Scout. The largest cub's name carried the meaning of protection and strength, so David called him Guard. 3 hours into their flight through the forest, David realized something remarkable was happening. He was keeping up with creatures who were clearly built for running through rough terrain. More than that, he was anticipating their movements, understanding their hand signals, and even beginning to sense their emotions without direct contact. The telepathic connection was working both ways, and it was making them function as a team. When Scout suddenly stopped and pointed to their left, David didn't question it. He immediately changed direction, leading them down a steep slope covered in loose rocks. Behind them, he heard their pursuers continue straight ahead, missing the turn. The cubs had somehow sensed the adult creature's movements and helped David avoid them. "You three are amazing," David panted as they paused to rest beside a stream. You're not just smart, you're tactical. Pip approached and placed her hand on David's arm again. This time the mental images were clearer. She showed him the adult creatures in the clearing around their den, but not as the angry pursuers David remembered. In Pip's memories, these adults were strangers, not the cubs' original family. She showed him different adults, older and gentler, who had cared for them before something terrible happened. Those aren't your parents, David realized. They're from a different group, aren't they? That's why you're afraid of them. All three cubs nodded vigorously. Through their combined mental link, David got a clearer picture of what had happened. The cubs were from a different tribe or family group. Something had attacked their home, scattering or killing the adults who cared for them. They had been hiding in the abandoned den when David found them, and now a different group of their species was trying to claim them. The cubs didn't want to go with the strangers. They wanted to stay with David, the first adult who had shown them kindness since their world had been destroyed. This is more complicated than I thought, David muttered. You're not just following me because you imprinted on me. You're refugees, and I'm the only one you trust. A distant roar reminded David that their pursuers were still searching for them. He stood up and shouldered his pack again. The caves were still 2 miles away, and night was falling. They needed to keep moving. As they continued through the darkening forest, David found himself thinking about his old life on Earth. He had always been a loner, preferring the company of books and microscopes to other humans. But now, running through an alien wilderness with 3 orphaned children depending on him for protection, David felt more alive and purposeful than he ever had before. The cubs had chosen him, and he had chosen them back. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The river crossing appeared suddenly through the morning mist, a wide stretch of fast-moving water that sparkled silver in the early sunlight. David stopped at the edge and checked his map. This was the Singing River, named for the musical sound. The water made as it flowed over the smooth stones in its bed. On the other side lay the cave system, where he hoped to find safety for himself and the cubs. Pip, Scout, and Guard gathered around him, their fur damp with dew and their large eyes alert for danger. They had spent the night in a hollow tree, taking turns keeping watch while the others slept. The cubs' telepathic abilities had proven invaluable for detecting their pursuers, allowing them to stay 1 step ahead throughout the night. David studied the river carefully. It was too deep and fast for him to cross safely, but the cubs were natural swimmers with their powerful limbs and dense fur. They could make it across easily while he searched for a fallen log or shallow crossing. "You 3 go ahead," David said, pointing across the water. "I'll find another way across and meet you on the other side." But the cubs shook their heads firmly. Pip placed her small hand on David's arm and sent him a clear mental message. They would not leave him behind. They were family now, and family stayed together. David felt a warm glow in his chest at their loyalty, but also frustration. "I'm holding you back. Your people can't follow you as easily if you're on the other side of the river." Scout stepped forward and chittered softly, pointing upstream. Through their mental link, David caught an image of what the young alien had spotted. About 100 yards up the river, a massive tree had fallen across the water, creating a natural bridge. "Good eyes," David said, ruffling the fur on Scout's head. "Let's go." They made their way upstream along the rocky bank. The fallen tree was huge, easily 4 feet in diameter, with thick bark that would provide good grip. David tested it carefully before starting across, with Guard right behind him and Pip and Scout bringing up the rear. Halfway across the river, David heard the sound that had been haunting him for 2 days. A deep, resonant roar echoed from the forest behind them. Their pursuers had found the crossing. "Move fast," David called to the cubs. "They're right behind us." That's when he saw the creature in the water. It looked like a cross between a crocodile and a shark, easily 20 feet long with multiple rows of teeth and eyes that glowed like yellow lamps beneath the surface. It had been hiding in the deep pool below the fallen tree, and now it was rising toward them with predatory intent. David's blood turned to ice as he realized what was happening. The creature was positioning itself to attack whoever fell into the water, but it wasn't looking at him or the cubs. Its glowing eyes were fixed on a point behind them. David spun around and saw Elder Thoros, the leader of the adult aliens, stepping carefully onto the fallen tree. The massive creature was trying to cross after them, but his great weight was making the dead tree creak and bend. Behind him, other adult aliens waited on the bank, clearly afraid to follow their leader onto the unstable bridge. The water predator had been hunting these creatures for who knows how long. It knew exactly how much weight the tree could bear before someone fell into its domain. Elder Thoros was walking into a trap. David didn't think. He acted on pure instinct, the same instinct that had driven him to help the cubs in the first place. He turned around and ran back toward the alien leader, shouting and waving his arms. "Stop! Don't go any further! There's something in the water!" Elder Thoros halted, confusion replacing anger on his massive features. He couldn't understand David's words, but the human's obvious distress was unmistakable. The alien leader looked down at the water and saw what David had seen. The predator was directly below him now, its jaws opening wide. David reached Elder Thoros just as the tree gave way. The dead wood cracked with a sound like thunder, and both human and alien plunged toward the waiting monster. But David had planned for this. As they fell, he activated his emergency flare gun and fired directly into the creature's open mouth. The flare exploded in a burst of red fire and chemical smoke. The predator convulsed in pain and confusion, thrashing wildly as David and Elder Thoros hit the water. David grabbed the alien leader's thick fur and swam desperately toward the bank, his lungs burning from the cold water and his muscles screaming from the effort of towing such a massive creature. The other adult aliens rushed to help, pulling their leader to safety while David collapsed on the rocky shore, gasping and shivering. The water predator had disappeared back into the depths, discouraged by its encounter with human technology. Elder Thoros sat up slowly, water streaming from his fur. He looked at David with something that might have been surprise or respect, or perhaps both. When he spoke, his deep voice was softer than before, though still incomprehensible to human ears. Pip scampered over to David and placed both hands on his face. Through their mental connection, she began translating what Elder Thoros was saying. The process was difficult and fragmentary, like trying to tune in a distant radio station. But slowly David began to understand. Elder Thoros was asking why the human had risked his life to save an enemy. David sat up, still catching his breath, and looked directly into the alien leader's intelligent eyes. "Because you're not my enemy," David said simply. "You're trying to protect children, just like I am. That makes us the same." Pip translated his words into whatever telepathic language the adult aliens used. Elder Thoros listened intently, then replied at length. Through Pip's translation, David learned that the alien leader was confused. In his culture, only family members risked their lives for each other. Strangers, especially strangers from different species, did not make such sacrifices. "On my world, we believe that protecting children is everyone's responsibility," David explained. "It doesn't matter whose children they are. When a child is in danger, any adult who can help should help." This concept seemed to stagger Elder Thoros. He spoke rapidly to his companions, who had gathered in a circle around David and the cubs. Their conversation was animated, with much gesturing and what sounded like debate. Finally, Elder Thoros turned back to David and spoke again. Pip's translation came through more clearly this time, as if their mental connection was getting stronger with practice. Elder Thoros wanted to know why the cubs refused to leave David. In their culture, children always obeyed their elders and returned to their tribe when called. The fact that Pip, Scout, and Guard would choose a strange alien over their own people was unprecedented and troubling. Through Pip, David explained what he had learned about the Cubs' origins. They were not from Elder Thoros' tribe. They were orphans from a different group, survivors of some catastrophe that had left them alone and frightened. They had bonded with David not just because he was the first adult they met, but because he had shown them kindness when they needed it most. Elder Thoros listened to this explanation with growing amazement. Then he asked Pip a direct question, and her response made all the adult aliens step back in shock. "What did you tell him?" David asked. Through their link, Pip showed David what she had shared with Elder Thoros. She had told him about the metal creatures that had attacked her original home, machines that moved like animals but felt no pain, showed no mercy, and consumed everything in their path. They had destroyed her tribe's village and killed most of the adults while the cubs hid in terror. Elder Thoros spoke urgently to his companions, and David caught one word that made his blood run cold. It sounded like devourers, and the fear in the alien leader's voice was unmistakable. "You know about these machines," David said. It wasn't a question. Elder Thoros nodded grimly and spoke at length. Through Pip's translation, David learned that the mechanical creatures had been attacking settlements across this region of the moon for several months. They appeared without warning, stripped areas of all organic matter, and then moved on to the next target. Elder Thoros' people had been preparing for war against them, gathering warriors from multiple tribes, but they were losing. The machines were too numerous, too relentless, and too well armed for primitive weapons to defeat. Elder Thoros had been searching for the cubs not to punish David, but because he had hoped they might have information about the machine's weaknesses. Their original tribe had been one of the few to mount any effective resistance. David felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. If mechanical creatures were stripping this moon of life, then his research team was in danger. The POW ship wouldn't return for another week, and they had no idea what was waiting for them. "We have to work together," David said to Elder Thoros. "Your people know how to fight, and my people have technology that might help against these machines, but we can't do it alone." Elder Thoros considered this for a long moment, then spoke briefly to Pip. Her translation was simple but profound. Elder Thoros accepted David as a warrior protector of children, a role that existed in their culture but had never been filled by an alien before. The cubs could stay with David, but only if David agreed to help fight the devourers. David looked down at Pip, Scout, and Guard, who were watching him with complete trust in their large, dark eyes. Then he looked at Elder Thoros and the other adult aliens who were offering him a chance to save not just the cubs, but potentially both their species. "I accept," David said. "We fight together." Elder Thoros smiled, revealing teeth that could have easily torn David apart but were now offered in friendship. The alliance had been formed, and the real battle was about to begin. The War Council took place in a natural amphitheater deep in the forest, where ancient trees formed a circle around a clearing carpeted with soft grass. David sat cross-legged with Pip, Scout, and Guard clustered around him, while Elder Thoros and representatives from 6 different tribes arranged themselves in the traditional talking circle. David had been living with the allied tribes for 4 days now, and he was beginning to understand their complex social structure. Each tribe specialized in different skills. Some were master trackers, others were craftsmen who made weapons and tools, and still others were the keepers of oral history and strategy. Elder Thoros' tribe served as diplomats and mediators between the groups. What amazed David most was how quickly the tribes had accepted him. Once Elder Thoros declared him a protector of children, the other leaders treated him with the same respect they would show any warrior. They listened to his ideas about fighting the devourers and shared their own knowledge freely. The cubs had become his translators and cultural guides. Pip's telepathic abilities had grown stronger with practice, allowing her to translate complex concepts between David and the adult aliens. Scout had appointed himself as David's technical advisor, studying the human's equipment and helping him understand how alien technology might work. Guard remained his personal protector, always alert for danger and ready to defend his adopted human parent. Now they faced their greatest challenge yet. The Devourers were coming. Elder Thoros stood and addressed the council in his deep, resonant voice. Through Pip's translation, David learned that the mechanical army had been detected 3 valleys away, moving steadily toward the forest where all the tribes had gathered. They had perhaps 2 days before the attack began. "Tell me about these machines," David said to the assembled leaders. "What do they look like? How do they move? What weapons do they use?" The tribal representatives took turns describing their encounters with the Devourers. David listened carefully. Building a mental picture of their enemy, the machines came in several different types: small scout units that moved like metal spiders, medium-sized soldiers that walked upright like mechanical humans, and massive harvesters that consumed organic matter and converted it into raw materials for making more machines. "They're self-replicating," David realized with growing alarm. "They're not just an invasion force, they're a plague. Every battle they win makes them stronger while making you weaker." Elder Thoros nodded grimly. His people had learned this lesson the hard way. Early attempts to fight the Devourers in open battle had ended in disaster. The machines simply repaired themselves using the bodies of the fallen and built new units from the destroyed villages. "What about their weaknesses?" David asked. "There must be something that stops them or slows them down." This question sparked an animated discussion among the tribal leaders. Through Pip's translation, David learned that the machines seemed to have difficulty with certain types of terrain. Deep water confused their sensors, and they moved slowly through very dense vegetation. They also appeared to have some kind of central coordination system, because damaging one machine sometimes caused others to behave erratically. But most importantly, they couldn't replicate certain rare materials. The machines could process wood, flesh, bone, and common metals, but they seemed unable to work with the crystalline formations that occurred naturally in some parts of the moon. "The blue stones," Scout chittered excitedly, tugging on David's sleeve. Through their mental connection, the young alien showed David images of deposits of blue-green crystals that were found in caves throughout the region. "They can't process the crystals," David said thoughtfully. "That might be our key advantage." Elder Thoros leaned forward, interested. David pulled out his scanner and activated the communication function. He had been trying to contact the research vessel Harmony for days with no success. The ship wouldn't return to pick him up for another week, but if the Devourers were as dangerous as the aliens described, his crewmates needed to be warned. Finally, on his 5th attempt, the communicator crackled to life. "David, thank God you're alive!" The voice belonged to Dr. Rachel Chen, the expedition leader. "We thought you were dead. We've been monitoring some kind of massive energy signatures in your area. What's your situation?" "Rachel, listen carefully," David said urgently. "There's an army of self-replicating machines moving through this region. They consume organic matter and use it to build more units. The entire moon is under attack." There was a long pause before Rachel responded. "David, that's impossible. Our sensors would have detected something like that." "Your sensors are designed to detect natural phenomena and basic technology. These machines are unlike anything we've encountered before. How well armed is the Harmony?" Another pause. "We have standard defensive systems for a research vessel, nothing military grade. David, if what you're saying is true, we need to evacuate the system immediately." "No," David said sharply. "If you leave, these machines will eventually spread to other worlds. We have to stop them here." Elder Thoros spoke up, and Pip translated his words. "The Elder says his people will fight whether your ship helps or not, but they will probably lose without better weapons." David relayed this to Rachel, explaining about his alliance with the native tribes and their knowledge of the Devourer's weaknesses. He described the crystals that the machines couldn't process and suggested that they might be used to create weapons or barriers. "David, this is insane," Rachel replied. "You're talking about fighting a war alongside aliens we've never properly studied, using technology we don't understand against an enemy that sounds like something out of a nightmare." "Yes," David said simply. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. Because if we don't fight this war, there won't be anyone left to study." The conversation continued for another hour, with David describing everything he had learned about the Devourers and the Tribal Alliance. He explained about the Cubs and their unique abilities, particularly Pip's talent for sensing the machine's internal structure through some form of technological telepathy she had developed. Finally, Rachel agreed to help. The Harmony would return early, bringing what weapons and supplies they could spare. But she warned David that the research vessel was no match for a large-scale mechanical army. "We'll just have to be clever instead of strong," David told her. "That's what humans are supposed to be good at, right?" After ending the communication, David turned to address the War Council. Through Pip's translation, he explained that his people would return to help fight the Devourers. But the real battle would still be won or lost by the combined efforts of humans and aliens working together. Elder Thoros asked about David's plan for using the crystals against the machines. David had been thinking about this problem since learning about the Devourer's weakness. "We can't fight them directly," he explained. "But we can use the crystals to create traps and barriers that will force them into areas where we have advantages. We'll use their own behavior patterns against them." Scout chittered excitedly and showed David a mental image of crystal formations he had seen in the caves near their current location. The young alien had been exploring while the adults talked, and he had discovered something interesting. The crystals grew in specific patterns that seemed to channel and amplify energy. "You think we can use the crystals as some kind of weapon?" David asked. Through their combined mental link, the Cubs showed David their plan. They had been thinking about this problem too, and their unique perspective as children who had survived. The Devourer's initial attacks gave them insights the adults might have missed. The machines followed predictable search patterns when hunting for organic matter. If you knew how they moved, you could predict where they would go. The crystals could be arranged to create energy feedback loops that would disable the machines' coordination systems. And most importantly, the Cubs' telepathic abilities allowed them to sense the machine's internal processes and identify critical components. David looked around the War Council, seeing determination and hope on the faces of aliens who had been fighting a losing battle for months. With human technology, alien knowledge, and 3 brilliant young strategists, they might actually have a chance. "Tomorrow we start preparing the battlefield," David announced. "The Devourers think they're hunting us, but we're going to turn this forest into the biggest trap they've ever walked into." Elder Thoros translated David's words for the other tribal leaders, and a cheer went up from the assembled warriors. For the first time since the mechanical plague had begun, they believed victory might be possible. The Cubs pressed close to David, their emotions flowing through their mental connection. Pride, determination, and absolute trust in their adopted, human father. Whatever came next, they would face it together as a family. The research vessel Harmony hung in the sky above Altara 7 like a metal moon, its hull glowing with the heat of rapid atmospheric entry. From his position in the forest clearing that served as their command post, David watched the ship's shuttles descend toward the designated landing zone. His heart pounded with a mixture of relief and terror. The final battle was about to begin. Pip pressed against his leg, her small hand gripping his pants as she shared her emotional state through their mental link. She was scared, but trying to be brave for her brothers. Scout and guard flanked David on either side, their young faces set in expressions of grim determination that looked strange on features so childlike. The past 2 days had transformed the forest into a maze of crystal formations and carefully hidden traps. Working together, humans and aliens had arranged the blue-green crystals in patterns that Scout had designed based on his study of the Devourer's behavior. The formations created energy feedback loops that would disrupt the machine's coordination systems, but only if the Devourers could be lured into exactly the right positions. Elder Thoros approached the command post, his massive frame moving with surprising stealth through the underbrush. Behind him came the other tribal leaders, all wearing expressions of nervous anticipation. Through Pip's translation, David learned that the scouts had detected the first Devourer units moving through the valley below. How many? David asked. The answer made his stomach clench. Over 300 machines of various sizes, moving in perfect formation toward the forest. The largest harvesters were the size of buildings, their metal bodies bristling with cutting tools and processing equipment. The smaller units moved like a swarm of deadly insects, covering every possible escape route. David activated his communicator. "Rachel, what's your status?" Dr. Chen's voice crackled through the device, tense with concentration. "We're in position above the target zone. David, I have to ask you one more time. Are you sure about this plan? We're risking everything on the word of 3 alien children and a bunch of crystals." David looked down at Pip, whose large dark eyes reflected complete faith in him. Through their mental connection, he felt her absolute certainty that their plan would work. She had studied the Devourers during her tribe's final battle, learning things about their internal structure that even the machines themselves might not understand. "I'm sure," David said into the communicator. "The Cubs know these machines better than anyone. Trust them like I do." "Beginning our approach," Rachel replied. "Whatever happens down there, David, I want you to know that what you've done here is remarkable. Making first contact, forming an alliance, organizing a resistance. The scientific community will study your methods for decades." "Let's make sure there's still a scientific community to study anything," David said grimly. The sound reached them. First, a mechanical humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Then the trees at the edge of the clearing began to shake as the Devourer army approached. David could see flashes of metal between the trunks, moving with inhuman precision. "And coordination. Positions, everyone," David called out. The tribal warriors melted into the forest, taking up carefully planned hiding spots among the crystal formations. The Cubs stayed close to David, their role too important to risk in direct combat. The first machines to enter the clearing were scouts, spider-like units with multiple legs and sensor arrays that swept back and forth like mechanical eyes. They moved cautiously, clearly detecting something unusual about the area, but unable to identify the threat. Behind the scouts came the soldiers. Humanoid machines armed with energy weapons and cutting tools. Their metal bodies were pitted and scarred from previous battles, but they moved with deadly efficiency. Finally, the harvesters appeared, massive machines that dwarfed everything else in the clearing. David held his breath as the Devourers spread out across the clearing, positioning themselves exactly where Scout had predicted they would go. Thus, young alien's understanding of machine behavior was proving remarkably accurate. "Now, Pip," David whispered. The smallest cub placed both hands on the nearest crystal formation and closed her eyes. Through their mental connection, David felt her consciousness expand, touching the energy patterns flowing through the crystal network. She was using her telepathic abilities to activate the trap they had spent 2 days preparing. The effect was immediate and devastating. Energy feedback loops cascaded through the crystal formations, creating electromagnetic pulses that disrupted the Devourer's coordination systems. Machines that had been moving in perfect unity suddenly began stumbling into each other, their sensors overloaded by conflicting signals. The tribal warriors struck from their hiding places, using weapons tipped with crystal fragments to target the machine's most vulnerable components. They had studied the Devourer's weak points under David's guidance, learning to disable rather than destroy, preventing the machines from using their own wreckage as raw materials. But the Devourers adapted quickly. The larger units began falling, back toward the forest edge, trying to escape the crystal field's influence. If they succeeded in regrouping outside the trap, they would overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. "Rachel, we need that air support now," David called into his communicator. "Coming in hot," Dr. Chen replied. "Clear the center of the field." David signaled to Elder Thoros, who roared a command that sent all the tribal warriors diving for cover. Seconds later, the research vessel's shuttle screamed overhead, its cargo bay doors open. Crystalline formations rained down from the sky, each one precisely targeted by the Cub's telepathic guidance. Scout had explained his strategy to David during the planning phase. Instead of trying to destroy the Devourers, they would trap them in an ever-expanding network of crystal formations. Each new crystal installation would extend the range of the electromagnetic field, eventually covering the entire valley. The plan worked perfectly for the first few minutes. Devourers found themselves caught between crystal formations, their coordination systems failing as the energy feedback loops multiplied. Tribal warriors darted between the installations, using hit-and-run tactics to disable individual machines. Then everything went wrong. The largest harvester, a machine the size of a small building, began converting its own internal systems into a massive energy weapon. David watched in horror as the machine's chest cavity opened to reveal a pulsing core that gathered power from its fellow Devourers. "It's going to overload the crystal network," Scout chittered in alarm, his mental voice filled with panic. "If it fires, the feedback will destroy all our formations." David's mind raced. They had planned for many contingencies, but not for this. The Devourers were more adaptable than anyone had anticipated. In seconds, their carefully constructed trap would be turned against them. "Rachel, I need an emergency pickup," David said into his communicator. "3 passengers, immediate extraction." "David, what are you doing?" Dr. Chen's voice was sharp with concern. David looked down at the Cubs, who were staring at him with complete trust, despite the chaos around them. They didn't understand what he was planning, but they were ready to follow him anywhere. "Taking the fight to them," David said. "If we can't stop that harvester from here, we'll have to stop it from the inside." The shuttle's emergency beam transported David and the Cubs directly into the harvester's cargo bay. The machine's interior was a maze of processing equipment and storage compartments, all humming with mechanical life. Red lights pulsed along the walls, indicating that the weapon system was charging toward critical levels. "Find the core," David told the Cubs. "Pip, can you sense where the main processor is located?" The smallest Cub closed her eyes and extended her telepathic senses through the machine's systems. After a moment, she pointed toward the center of the harvester, where the weapon core was building toward overload. They fought their way through the machine's internal defenses, dodging mechanical arms and cutting tools while following Pip's telepathic guidance. Scout identified weak points in the harvester's structure, showing David where to place the improvised explosive charges he had brought from his research kit. Guard proved his worth as a protector, using his strength and agility to clear obstacles and shield David from the machine's defensive systems. The young alien moved with a warrior's instinct, anticipating threats and responding with split-second timing. They reached the central core just as the weapons system reached critical charge. The pulsing energy core was beautiful and terrifying, a sphere of contained lightning that could level the entire forest if it discharged properly. "Can you disrupt it?" David asked Pip. The Cub placed her hands on the nearest control surface and sent her consciousness into the machine's systems. For a moment, David felt what she was experiencing through their mental link, a vast digital maze of interconnected processes and data streams. It was like nothing human technology had ever created, alien in its logic but following patterns that Pip could understand. The weapon core's charge began to fluctuate as Pip worked to disable its firing mechanisms, but the machine was fighting back, trying to expel the foreign presence from its systems. Pip's small body trembled with the effort of maintaining her. mental grip on processes that were never meant to be controlled by organic consciousness. "I've got her," David said, placing his hands on Pip's shoulders to provide physical support. Through their connection, he felt Scout and Guard joining the effort, their combined mental strength giving Pip the power she needed to complete her sabotage. The weapon core destabilized with a sound like breaking crystal. Instead of firing outward at the forest, the energy discharge turned inward, cascading through the harvester's own systems. The massive machine convulsed as its internal processes collapsed, then toppled backward into the forest with a crash that shook the ground. David activated his communicator as emergency transport beams surrounded him and the cubs. "Rachel, get us out of here! Mission accomplished!" They materialized on the shuttle just as the harvester's destruction sent shockwaves through the remaining devourer forces. Without their largest unit to coordinate the attack, the smaller machines began, wandering aimlessly, their formation breaking apart. The tribal warriors emerged from hiding to mop up the stragglers, using crystal-tipped weapons to disable the confused machines. The battle was over, but David barely noticed. He was focused entirely on Pip, who had collapsed from the mental strain of her telepathic sabotage. Her breathing was shallow, and her large eyes were unfocused with exhaustion. "Is she going to be okay?" David asked Dr. Chen, who was running a medical scanner over the small alien. "Her vital signs are stable, but she's suffering from some kind of neural fatigue," Rachel replied. "David, what exactly did she do in there?" David explained how Pip had used her telepathic abilities to hack into the harvester's computer systems, something that should have been impossible for an organic mind to accomplish. The cubs weren't just telepathic, they were living interfaces between biological and digital consciousness. "She saved us all," David said, gently stroking Pip's fur as she slept in his arms. "All three of them did. They're not just children. Rachel, they're the future of cooperation between organic and digital intelligence." The shuttle touched down in the forest clearing, where Elder Thoros and the tribal leaders were waiting. The aftermath of the battle was visible everywhere. Disabled machines scattered between crystal formations, but no casualties among the defenders. The plan had worked perfectly, thanks to the Cubs' unique abilities and the trust between human and alien allies. Elder Thoros approached David as he carried Pip from the shuttle, with Scout and Guard staying close beside him. The alien leader spoke at length in his deep, rumbling voice. "What's he saying?" David asked Scout, since Pip was still unconscious. The young alien's telepathic translation was clearer than ever before, as if their shared experience in the harvester had strengthened all their mental connections. Elder Thoros was offering David permanent citizenship in the Tribal Confederation, along with a new title that had never been given to an alien before, Guardian of the Young. "He says, 'You are family now,'" Scout explained through their mental link. "Not just to us, but to all the children of all the tribes. You will help raise the next generation to understand both our ways and your ways." David looked around at the assembled tribal leaders, all nodding their agreement with Elder Thoros's offer. Then he looked down at the cubs, who had become more important to him than his own life. Finally, he looked at Dr. Chen and the other humans from the research vessel. "Rachel, I need to ask you something," David said. "How would the scientific community feel about having a permanent research station on Altara 7? One focused on studying human-alien cooperation and developing new forms of communication technology." Dr. Chen smiled, understanding immediately what David was really asking. "I think they'd be very interested in that, especially if the station was run by someone with unique experience in cross-species diplomacy." David turned back to Elder Thoros and nodded formally. "I accept your offer. This is my home now, and these are my people." The tribal leaders erupted in cheers, a sound that was picked up and echoed by hundreds of voices throughout the forest. The alliance between humans and the native peoples of Altara 7 would continue, growing stronger with each generation. Pip stirred in David's arms, her large eyes opening to focus on his face. Through their mental connection, he felt her joy and relief that he had chosen to stay. She sent him a flood of images, the three cubs growing up under his guidance, learning about both human and alien cultures, becoming bridges between two very different forms of consciousness. "Welcome home, Dad," Scout said through their shared telepathic link, using a human concept he had learned from David's memories. David felt tears running down his face as he looked at his adopted family. He had come to Altara 7 as a lonely scientist studying plants and small creatures. He was staying as a father, a diplomat, and a guardian of the future. The cubs pressed close to him, their purring filling the air with a sound of pure contentment. Around them, humans and aliens worked together to build something unprecedented, a truly cooperative society where different forms of intelligence could thrive together. David Reed had found his place in the universe at last. It wasn't in a laboratory or a lecture hall, but in a forest clearing surrounded by alien children who had taught him that family isn't about genetics or species. It's about choosing to protect and nurture each other, no matter how different you might be. The stars above Altara 7 shone down on a new kind of family, forged in the fire of battle and strengthened by bonds that transcended the boundaries between worlds.